I wanted to say, first of all, just how pleased I am to see this show. It's, I think, really the first major museum exhibition of electronic literature. There have been a number of these in different venues throughout the years, but they've typically been small or associated with a festival. And I wanted to say that Rod and I put together a series of exhibitions last summer, and we know how much work is involved. So it's really wonderful to see it done so professionally, and we're really honored to be in this show. And I hope that this is a sort of trend that continues, because it really is a wonderful way to bring new audiences to digital literature. I was just in London a couple of weeks ago and saw the Electronic Superhighway exhibition, which was sort of 50 years of digital art. And while I was there, I was sort of surprised at how many of the works that they were showing included text. But the text was often sort of used as a material or used as a kind of afterthought. You walked into the gallery and the first thing you saw was a woman's posterior with tweets coming out of it. And that was kind of the attitude that seemed to be, they seem to have towards text. So it's really important, I think, that we're able to show the power of poetics and storytelling in exhibitions like this. I've often, throughout the years, a lot of my work has been collaborative, and I'm really pleased to be introducing the collaboration that Roderick and I have been engaged in the last 5 years. As you said, mainly projects that are in some ways engaging with or reflecting political reality through digital storytelling. And it's this sort of interesting moments, I think, and you'll see this, that in our work that's in the gallery, you're not seeing text on the screen, you're hearing it through spoken word, through spoken narrative. And I think it's this sort of interesting moment where there's a confusion or blending of boundaries between different art forms. And our collaboration really comes out of this kind of engagement with thinking about how different art forms can work together, and taking some of the techniques and methods from digital literature and then applying them to digital cinema. So our collaboration started about 4 or 5 years ago when Roderick came as a visiting researcher to the University of Bergen. And we were talking, and we've been friends for many years, and we realized that although we've both done a lot of collaborative work with other artists, that we had never worked together on a project. And do you want to say a few words about the first pieces that we'll show?
So we're going to, thanks Scott and thanks Laura, and thank you Giovanna for this great show. We're going to show segments of 3 works today. The first project we'll be showing is a catastrophe piece from the Catastrophe trilogy, which is a work that began during this initial collaboration in Bergen in 2011. And the piece we'll be looking at is one of the pieces in that trilogy, and it was recorded and premiered during the stay in Bergen at that time. All of the pieces in the trilogy concern historic disasters of one kind, catastrophes of one kind or another, that in some ways resonate with the contemporary landscape and resonate with contemporary conditions. The second work we'll be showing will be a segment of a project entitled 3 Rails Live, which is a collaboration with Scott, myself, and another poet, computer artist, Nick Mumford. And we'll be talking about that piece in a little bit. That has a very particular and unusual structure in the way it's designed, and a very particular set of collaborative constraints that we'll talk about too. And then for the third part, we'll be looking at Toxicity, which is installed here in the gallery, and we'll talk a little bit about its backstory and its construction, and then show in this very beautiful space a segment of that piece. So to introduce then, we're going to start with the first of the trilogy, from the Catastrophe trilogy, and this piece is entitled The Last Volcano.
Noen sier at det som skjer en gang, aldri skjer igjen. Andre sier at alt gjentar seg. En sommermorgen i mitt 20. år er himmelen jerntom. Solen filtreres gjennom skyer og støv, som ansiktet til en sint salamander. Juni er varm, veldig varm for Bergen. Først tror vi at det bare er en tørr sommerdis. Det har vært lite regn. Men disen forsvinner ikke. Kobberrøde skyer henger lavt og tykt og ligger over Bergen, som er omgitt av 7 fjell. Noen sier at det bare er støv som stiger opp fra fjellgårdene, med sine vanlige tørre marker. Solen er en flammende rød kul, og vi kan ikke huske en sommer så varm, eller en luft så kvelende som denne. Luften smaker av svovel, og noen sier at djevelen har vendt tilbake for å søke hevn for heksene, som ble brent på bålet på Nordnes i svunne tider. De sier at luften ikke er så ille hvis du er frisk. Bladene på trærne visner, og det ligger en merkelig form for støv over gresset på engen. Hele sommeren teller vi de døde. Det er ingen blå himmel å se på flere uker. Gårdene kommer med dårlige nyheter. Dyrene dør bort, og jorden avler ingenting. Det meldes om lam som faller som råtten frukt, med gult, skummende spytt og kjøtt allerede løs fra beinene. De unge kaster opp blod, og de eldste har dødd. Skipene blir ikke lenge i havna. De sier Bergen er en syk by. Noen sier at de gamle gudene våkner, misfornøyde med vår arroganse. Vi hører fra sjømenn at krigen i Amerika er avsluttet, og at franskmenn har sendt en globus aerostatikk til himmels. Veldig snart, sier de, vil menn reise gjennom himmelen, slik som fuglene flyr fra gren til gren, fra fjell til fjell, fra kongedømme til kongedømme. Jeg kan forestille meg dette, men mer som en drøm, og sveve over virvlende skyer av gul, grønn og oransje gass, under en fargerik luftballong på en vei til et sted hvor luften er ren. Ingen skip ligger lenge i havnene, og sjøfolkene glor mistenksomt på oss, som vi bærer en smitte som ikke lar seg vaske bort. Sommeren vil bli varm og vinteren kald. Det finnes ingen steder å flykte til, og ingenting som kan bli gjort. Det eneste sikre er at avlingene vil bli magre og livet vanskelig, og vi vil bære mange kister. Vi kommer til å gjenta de gamle historiene, eller vi kommer til å glemme dem. Tiden, er jeg sikker på, vil en dag ta slutt. Noen sier at det som skjer en gang, aldri skjer igjen. Andre sier at alt gjentar seg. En sommermorgen i mitt 20. år er himmelen jerntom. Solen filtreres gjennom skyer av støv, som ansiktet til en sint salamander. Juni er varm, veldig varm for Bergen.
Hva er det andre om det, da?
Først tror vi det at det bare er en tørr sommerdis. Det har vært lite regn. Men disen forsvinner ikke. Kobberrøde skyer henger lavt og tykt og ligger over byen, som er omgitt av 7 fjell. Noen sier at det bare er støv som stiger opp fra fjellgårdene, med sine uvanlige tørre marker. Solen er en flammende rød kule, og vi kan ikke huske en sommer så varm eller luft så kvelende som denne. Luften smaker av svovel, og noen sier at djevelen har vendt tilbake for å søke hevn for heksene som ble brent på bålet på Nordnes i svunne tider.
Hva er det handler om?
De sier at luften ikke er så ille hvis du er frisk. Bladene på trærne visner, og det ligger en merkelig form for støv over gresset på engen. Det er varmt nok til å bade i fjorden, men det letter ingenting. Hele sommeren teller vi de døde. Det er ingen blå himmel å se på flere uker. Gårdene kommer med dårlige nyheter. Dyrene er borte, og jorden avler ingenting. Det meldes om lam som faller om som råtten frukt, med gult, skummende spytt og kjøtt allerede løs fra beinene. De unge kaster opp blod, og de eldste har dødd. Skipene blir ikke lenge i havnene. De sier at Bergen er en syk by. Noen sier at de gamle gudene har våknet og misfornøyde med vår arroganse. Vi hører fra sjømenn at krigen i Amerika er avsluttet, og at franskmenn har sendt en globus aerostatikk til himmels. Veldig snart, sier de, vil menn reise gjennom himmelen, slik som fugler flyr fra gren til gren, fra fjell til fjell, fra kongedømme til kongedømme. Jeg kan forestille meg dette, men mer som en drøm. Å sveve over virvlende skyer av gul, grønn og oransje gass i en fargerik luftballong på vei til en sted hvor luften er ren. Ingen skip ligger lenge i havnen, og sjøfolkene glodende tenksomt på oss som vi bærer en smitte som ikke lar seg vaske bort. Sommeren vil bli varme og vinteren kald. Det finnes ingen steder å flykte og ingenting som kan bli
Fortell meg hva det
gjort.
handler om, da.
Det eneste som er sikkert, at anleggene blir magre og livet vanskelig.
Jo.
Vi vil bære magre
Fortell
kister.
meg hva det handler om.
Vi kommer til å gjenta de gamle historiene, eller vi kommer til å glemme dem. Tiden er jeg sikker på. Vi lever på slutt.
I want to tell you a little bit about combinatory poetics. You saw that this was a way to sort of introduce some of the kinds of themes that we're dealing with in our projects with the first film, where we were interested in cycles of disaster and cycles of reception of disaster and how we remember them. But I want to give you a quick introduction to the idea of combinatory poetics and of generation, and how we're working with that in a film context. But let me start with a quick poem. Scholar hates the spiritual seeker, whales perspire, tourists conspire, night corrupts the mobile phones, defeat the modern translucent, robust electric, gamer warms the cigarettes, prostitutes profile the spiritual seeker, excuse the blessed, dreamy, comic, expensive, jugglers smell the spiritual seeker, mutes hassle the machines, promote the chaotic, noisy, stinking, Godzilla eyes the bankers, scholars drain the mobile phone, command the smoke-filled, silent, comic, hacker ceremonializes the pachinko parlors, no enthusiast educate the motorcycle gang, paint the disoriented, scantily clad. This is a poetry generator. It's a hacked version of another poetry generator, if you want to call it poetry. It involves text generation, which doesn't mean that it's not written, but let me show you a little bit about how it's written and structured once we open up the source code here. You can see that the poem continues to write itself until we turn it off. But the way that it's actually assembling the language and putting the elements together are that we have an array of different elements. We have some things that are positioned in the top position, some things that are transitive verbs or intransitive verbs. And then we have a really pretty simple algorithm that puts these elements together into a structure. So when Nick and Rod and I started talking about something that we could do together, we became interested in the idea of, well, how do we apply combinatory poetics to the vernacular of film, and what could we actually do with that? And just to explain a little bit about the collaborative process, Rod sent. I don't know if this. Okay. Rod sent Nick and I a sort of a package of some images, some short clips of film and some static images that he had shot in various places, for instance, in the desert. And separately, Nick was in Boston, and I was in Bergen. Each of us reacted differently to this set of images and began writing texts in response to them. So my reaction to the images was to sort of begin to think of them in terms of categories or themes and kind of put them into buckets, and then begin writing very short stories, these very kind of compressed narratives in response to this set of 10 sets of images. Nick's response was and Nick's sort of a poet, to think in terms of turning these images into a form that Harry Matthews invented called the perverb, which is a yoking together of two proverbs. And then when we sort of went through several cycles of exchanging these images back and forth, and and text, and so Rod would send us new images in response to the text, and we would kind of work in this kind of iterative fashion. And then when we got them together, we said, well, how can we work with these two separate ideas of the text and put them together? So we decided that the narratives that I wrote could be a story component, and then the perverbs that Nick wrote could be the morals to that story. So just to give you a little quick idea of how this system is actually functioning, the program produces a title, and it's generated from different arrays of text. Then a story is generated, and we have voiceover clips, which are then assigned to video clips in a very, without any sort of necessary thematic connection between them, although they're operating in the same sort of pool of work. So you end up with the themes actually typically working together fairly well. And then there's 2 cycles of this, and then we experience a moral perverb, there's a transition, and the system starts again. So you can see that this is the type of arrays that we're working with in producing the film. We have the different sets of elements, and then the algorithm pulls them together into a structure that may or may not work. We're never quite sure until we run the program. So let's do that. So we'll watch a few cycles of 3 Rails Live.
There is terrible loneliness in the flood, awful desperation in bailing out. You find no consolation in sharing this. There is no one to blame, and so you'll blame each other. The accumulated years of petty failings come to this: 2 people carrying buckets of sewage. And you know in your heart it is your own fault, this storm, this dirty water, all of the conspiracies against you. Struggling to remember what is important and what is not. If it was so important, why did you put it down there to begin with? Electricity, osmosis, shit, garments, board games, waterborne disease, accumulation, rust, incompetence, meanness, labor, eels, and mortgages come to mind. He loved trains, associated them with childhood, the model train set circling round the Christmas tree. He remembered a sort of ride you used to see at old-time amusement parks, with train cars a child could propel by cycling with his hands faster and faster. He loved the music of trains, the shuffling noise they make as they move on the rails, the landscape shifting as he turned pages. Trains represented true progress, the slow progress of the careful reader, and the excited progress of the eager child. He never associated trains with death, never considered that the train might derail.
The moral of the story is: a fool and his money, sailor's delight.
In their final years, they settled their long-standing argument, train or plane, in her favor. He always preferred the speed of air travel. To her it always felt ungrounded, and though she bottled it, her fear of flight never actually dissipated, her knuckles white from coast to coast. Arthritis and a retirement account that could not accommodate business-class fares finally convinced him that the more comfortable seats on the train were preferable. And, she felt, it gave them both a new appreciation of time. She liked to knit. He did not complain, though in his heart he missed the sensation of descent. It was when they traveled to the oil refinery, just to see it, just to see what made the whole economy turn, up close with their own eyes. It was that day it first occurred to her. I may divorce this man. I could. I may leave him behind, like a used mop, like a tarnished silver spoon, like a tin can that used to contain soup. I may grow tired of him at any time, or he tired of me. We may die without each other. I may be alone.
The moral of the story is, like water off a big stick.
May I have your attention, please? Please do not leave cases or parcels unattended anywhere on the station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
In the Talon bar, an ABBA song pipes in through tinny loudspeakers as a tall Ukrainian woman in a platinum wig gyrates, removing one article at a time, unzipping a silvery dress, hooking it onto a pointy heel and flinging it off stage, unhooking a red sequin bra before caressing her own oiled breasts, spinning furiously around the pole and then mounting it in a fashion that seems to defy gravity, arching her back, heels in the air, the disco ball reflecting off her taut belly before she cartwheels off the phallic prop. And here he stands at the rail, a sickeningly sweet vodka grenadine cocktail in hand, an aging widower among young Russian toughs and middle-aged German salesmen in brown business suits, offering €5 notes to her G-string. She looks past them all to some imperceptible point in the distance, beyond the walls of the bar, even as she contorts to offer them her well-trimmed revelation, even as she does a sort of snake belly slither across the stage to allow the hooting Cossacks a close-up of her ass crack. He does not know why he is here or what he hopes to find, past any sense of eroticism, beyond feeling much of anything at all. The little creek out back was a selling point when we bought the house 20 years ago. My son used to catch tadpoles there, and we pretended to fish. Never caught anything but a cold. We played Huck Finn and made rafts for gnomes from twigs and stems. It was once a trickling thing. Summer Sundays I would sit out there in my Adirondack chair with the Times crossword, mumbling things like babbling brook. Now it is a swollen, raging thing, and her tulips and perennials are washing away. Improbable storm, the cruelty of calling it perfect, everything spongy and shifting, world turned mud. The rhododendrons are drowning. A swing set loosed from its foundation falls and floats away.
The moral of the story is,
Okay, one of the aspects of our work, which is probably apparent in the work you've seen so far, is that there's a blending of fictional and non-fictional elements, because a lot of the work builds narratively on top of the gathering of non-fiction works. So in my process, I go out and I shoot along sets of ideas, systems of images that I gather and collect in buckets, and develop a kind of process of looking at conditions of change, particularly in recent times, looking at a lot of sites where one might observe the impact of climate change. So in the last film we're going to show, but this was also true for Three Rails Live, but certainly in the last film we're going to look at, in Toxicity, the process began as one of a kind of visual research. I was out kayaking on the Delaware River in its tidal zones, a long stretch of river that passes many of the large cities on the American seaboard. The river is home to many of the America's largest oil refineries. It was once home to the American steel industry and shipbuilding industries and the central port for coal and many of the other dirty fossil fuels of the past. At the center of the Delaware, the most famous city is Philadelphia, which was in the 17th and 18th centuries the economic hub for the U.S., only to be surpassed by New York quite late in the 19th century. And the landscape is scarred by centuries of early industrial development. And along with Philadelphia, it includes cities, many of them in very poor states like Camden, New Jersey, and Wilmington, Delaware, Trenton, New Jersey. So my initial voyage was one of boating along these sites, recording an industrial landscape, and I began to speculate what would happen to these landscapes as rising seas from climate change would wash over a landscape of brown fields, of environmental cleanup zones, of active chemical repositories, and begin to mix all of this chemical waste into the land, washing over the cities, not just with salty, corrosive seawater, but with this toxic mix. And so I began to explore these landscapes and photograph them, recording what I could see within a potential tidal zone of future floods. Now the stories, this is a couple pictures from contemporary news, the story since we started filming this has changed. In the last year or two, the impact of climate change is becoming powerfully obvious, with even minor snowstorms. This was from a storm just a month ago. With minor snowstorms coupled with high tides, whole towns, villages get flooded. Atlantic City was under 8 feet of water in this particular storm. So the living with flooding is a fact of life, and will become increasingly a fact of life there, as it will be here. And one of the interesting aspects that we sort of started talking about, Scott and I, was, well, how will people adapt? On one hand, there's the terrible catastrophe of the big flood, of Hurricane Katrina, and on the other hand, there's the aspect that life goes on. And people make small adjustments in their life, and they will live with this new landscape. So I started going out and photographing from kayak this landscape to incorporate it into what would become our narrative film process, looking for documentary evidence for what would become, in a sense, a digital imaginary, the world we imagine we might live in the future. And that world has there are many ways that the stories might play out, so the combinatory structure is perfect, because with each array of images, we have one version of the future, then another, then another. And so I spent considerable time boating and bicycling along the shorelines, gathering images for a film and passing these along to Scott as he began to develop characters that would occupy this landscape in a future, while I was also recording it in its present day. Mapping was a very important part of this initial process, interweaving these sites with historic maps that indicated where sites, the sort of hidden pollutants were, because the landscape is full of hidden repositories of toxic soils that have since been built upon or left fallow. And I built up a chemical map, a kind of online resource identifying over 200 sites within the flood zones of potential toxicity, sites that would impact where people live, drinking water supplies, and so forth. This grew into a kind of non-fiction record, a log of exploration. And it's that log that I would then hand to Scott. He also started doing additional research on deaths that occurred during Hurricane Sandy and on the potential impact and what life would look like in a near future if events like Hurricane Sandy and the kind of regular flooding we see now become so frequent that it would force people to change where they live or their habits of life. So it's out of this kind of interactive writing and picturing a landscape in a nonfiction form that we move into narrative, and we carry this research into a fiction form. And that's where Scott, then working back and forth, we began to develop characters and develop an approach to a feature film structure for a combinatory film, which I think is pretty rare. It's a rare form to have. The full film refreshes itself about once an hour, and I hope you'll have a chance in the gallery to sit and watch it through one or another of its arrays, because every array is different. Every array features a different actor, different character as a dominant voice, while the others also tell parts of their stories. So on any visit, if you come back again on different times, you'll see a different film, and you'll always see a different film each time you confront this. So we don't know which film will show up here. We're gonna play a portion of it, so you get into the film and have a good experience of it, a substantial experience of it, and can really hear it with the wonderful projection and sound that we have here. Scott, would you like to load it, and anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I guess the only, we started working on this project right before Hurricane Sandy, and I remember the day that Sandy hit. The day after, I was in Edinburgh, and I got the newspaper in my hotel room, and I saw President Obama standing in front of this devastated shoreline. And I looked at the picture, and I thought, well, that looks remarkably familiar. And it turned out that he was standing about 2 blocks from the house where I had lived in New Jersey during the years that I lived there. So this, I think, both for Rod and I, this isn't something that was completely abstract. You're certainly seeing this all the time now in the flooding in Philadelphia. So there's really sort of there's kind of 2 layers to this narrative. One which is kind of absolutely non-fictional. There's a kind of rhythmically you're going to hear this chorus that we call it, where there's kind of death stories, these adopted obituaries, this very sort of odd genre that occurs when people die in a disaster. And I think we often sort of hear that 100 people died in New Jersey, or 300 people died during the storm. We move very quickly past that. So we're trying to keep that as a sort of reminder and sort of humanize what happens as a result of climate change through the inclusion of that layer. And then the other layer of the story, as Rod said, is a speculative narrative. So I'll go ahead and show it now.
What I remember most is the birds. The fish kills, they happen every now and again, sometimes for natural causes, and it doesn't bother you much other than the smell, the stink of rotten fish. Something leaks out, or they eat some bad algae, whatever, fish die. It's part of life on the river. Sometimes you steer your way through a nasty patch of floaters, bullhead, catfish, striped bass, white perch, gizzard, shad. Kills you to see a good eating fish oiled up like that. But the birds, the Canadian geese flying over this time of year, the feathers soak up the oil, and they look pathetic in the water, the geese and the ducks flapping around like that. The ones that make it to the shore try to run around and shake it off, but they're like half blind. They try to clean themselves, and they end up eating that sludge. It's really pitiful. They try to fly, and they can't anymore. Thousands of them. And Philadelphia International is right there, so it was kind of ironic watching it. The planes kept taking off and landing, but the birds couldn't get off the ground.
I was proud of the way we handled the first big storms. I'd say we did pretty well. A lot of people died. A lot of people. It was a catastrophic event. But we could have had many, many more fatalities if we hadn't rehearsed and coordinated and had such a great communication system in place. Then the sequesters came. You know, we had to cut 5% in 2013. That might not sound like much, but it was $1 billion haircut. Staff, services, supplies, trailers, blankets. And then we had 4 hurricanes in a row. All the problems with the chemical plants and water treatment facilities, all the toxins that leached up into the water supply, the meltdown in New Jersey, it hit everything, flooded every part of the system. We had every agency, from the National Guard to the Army Corps of Engineers to the NRC to OSHA to the FERC, Port Authority, Homeland on down, everybody trying to coordinate relief and reconstruction. Just as soon as we had one situation stabilized, we'd have another event. And what did Congress do? Once we'd blown past the year's budget, they called us to the carpet. Then they cut the budgets again in 15, 16, and 17. It's the death of logical thinking.
My big sister was a great swimmer, and she got a silver medal in the All-States one time, and Mom and Dad were so proud. They put signs on the car and everything, and her picture was in the paper with her, like, fist pumping when she broke some record. I guess she was with her boyfriend in his car when the big storm came. They'd been down by the river at a barbecue or something, and they were in the car, and the car got stuck in traffic with all the other cars when the water came, and she tried to get out, but they didn't get out in time, and she died.
The Prometheus? It was a big tanker, single bottom, double-sided, 750 foot, filled with crude, and we was towing it into berth number 11 so they could deliver the crude to the Citgo asphalt refinery in Paulsboro. The tug captain noticed it first, the oil in the water, and he says, "Oh shit, Frank, I think got a problem here." Cypriot ship, it had 13 million gallons of the stuff on the manifest. We notified the USCG right away. A few minutes later, the tanker lost power, and you could see it listing about 8 degrees on the port side. And all that stuff was just pouring out. You could see it separating in the water, tar sinking down, and the light stuff shining on the surface, and the smell of it in the water was like blacktop and dead fish. You hardly ever think about what's in those boats, but what we delivered to the asphalt refinery is real raw stuff, thick gunk that settles on the river bottom. I don't know, you could say it was anybody's fault. There was an old anchor in the water and a 15-foot piece of old pipe, and concrete slabs, enough debris to tear open the belly of a ship. Where it came from, who knows? Some things fall off and never get reported, other things wash in. In all these old factories, there's a lot of material down there people don't appreciate. It's a big river with a lot of old junk on the bottom. You do your best to navigate, but you know God rolls the dice, don't he?
People have different opinions about what's happening down in the wash. I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that those people are still American citizens, still human beings. I know the argument. They chose to hide out during the evacuations or to escape from the camps and go over the fences, and we can't take them back because of the danger of contamination. I understand how diseases spread if they don't get them under control. Don't get me wrong. I think those people are fools, and I understand the danger they pose. But they aren't rats. You shouldn't stop the aid agencies from helping them. I feel for the children is all.
Maureen in Jersey City died after her oxygen machine stopped working when the power went out. While she worked for the Jersey City Municipal Authority, her philosophy was simple. Strangers must be vetted. There was no way you could make it past her desk without an appointment. But once she confirmed you were there on official business, she would offer you a cup of coffee. It looks like she tried to make do with bottled oxygen once the machine stopped, but then she ran out.
The Homeland Security measures were supposed to be temporary. But like they say, give them an inch and they'll take the whole eastern seaboard. It's a hard time now. It's hard for the kids to live through this. Can you imagine? The kids born now, they won't remember the times when this was simply one country, before they set up all the regulated zones, before all the disasters and the spills and the water rights conflicts. I tell my kids, you could drive from one coast right to the other. You could drive all the way from here to California without stopping at one checkpoint. If you can imagine that.
Sunset almost makes me cry. Sometimes it's almost like a rainbow, all of the purples and oranges and blues, and even sometimes something like green in the clouds. I guess some of the gases up there are the reason why the sunset take on all these different hues. I know it's probably the air pollution and that it's bad. It's why it's hard to breathe sometimes on hot summer days. But whatever the reason, it's still kind of magical. Life is hard, but I think it's sort of our job to live in the moments that we have now.
Lauren stepped outside of her home in Richmond Hills to take some pictures of the storm she could post on the internet. She stepped on a downed electric line she didn't see, was electrocuted, and died on the scene. The 23-year-old beautician caught fire, and her neighbors could see the flames through the window as she burned. Her family later sued Con Ed for wrongful death.
There are things in the wash that scare me. There are dogs and coyotes, but worst of all are the boars, and they'll eat anything. They'll eat corpses if they find them on the riverbanks or in the ruins of houses. In a way, it's beautiful that all of these animals are getting a new home, but still, they frighten me when I'm alone.
Around the time of the first big hurricane in 2012, we figured it was just a freak thing, one of those 100-year, whatever, 200-year events. And we were lucky around here, really. A little flooding, so what? The Schuylkill floods at least twice a year. You clean up and get on with it. What we got here was like an ordinary event, basically, not like what hit them in New York or on the Jersey Shore. Of course, nobody could anticipate these things would start coming regular, that the East Coast would start having hurricane seasons, just like those poor people down in the regulated territories in Florida and what used to be New Orleans. Now, there's a lot of places that used to be places and are places no more. A lot of evacuation zones that will never dry out again. Do you remember Atlantic City? We used to have so much fun. The boardwalk.
Gary, a 38-year-old truck driver from Summit, was tubing near the Delaware River Family Campground in Knowlton Township with his 14-year-old daughter, Ciara, when a sudden current flipped them into the river. Ciara suffered minor injuries, but was able to make it to shore. Gary didn't have a life jacket and was pulled under. His body was found the next week 35 miles downriver on the shore near Frenchtown. Authorities said they had tried to warn people to stay out of the river because recent rains had raised water levels to dangerous heights.
The Pentagon takes some of our advice, but more often, they ignore it. It's a different situation now. FEMA used to be about helping people see their way through, about helping people rebuild. But with so many places wiped out and so many people suffering, FEMA can't help much. In the new regime, we're all about taking out the garbage, clearing the debris, sealing things off. The military deals with keeping order and restoring basic infrastructure. We coordinate the cleanup, we bulldoze the buildings, we get the bodies in body bags and ship them off to the morgue. We send teeth to the forensic dentists. Sometimes the teeth are all we have to send. Sometimes we needed to take a mobile crematorium on site to dispose of the contaminated cadavers. Those remains won't take care of themselves. They pose serious health risks. It's all about containment. You know how they say doctors have a certain bedside manner? On this job, you develop a sort of graveside manner. We try to get all the survivors the hell off a site as soon as we possibly can, but people never want to leave their homes, their properties, their families, their memories. And they are in a lot of pain. And you feel that pain in a real, palpable way. And honestly, you want it out of your sight. I see their faces. I wake up feeling cold.
Augustine lived in Hempstead and worked in a nearby medical facility. A week and a half after the storm, the traffic lights on Franklin Avenue and Valley Stream were still out of order, and a white 2007 Nissan struck and killed her as she was crossing Linden Street. Her family took her body back to the Dominican Republic to bury her in the land of her birth.
I used to come out this way to try and catch fish. I pulled perch, striped bass, a lot of good eating fish. Nowadays, of course, with the contaminants, they say it ain't safe. I never know what to believe. It's a powerful river, can wash a lot of stuff away. Not right now, of course. I mean, look at it. After a hurricane, there was no point in fishing with all the sewage and debris. So what am I doing here? I ain't fishing for fish. I aim to get some furniture. Now, most of your contemporary pieces, like that recliner there, are useless when you pull them out. But a lot of folks around here had antiques, period pieces, stuff they got handed down. Like, look, that dresser there, I'm gonna try to snag it. I gotten some great pieces. Damaged, sure, but not past refinishing. My garage is full of this stuff. And once they're in the river, they don't belong to anybody, you know? Yesterday, I pulled out a captain's chair, must be 200 years old. And once these people come out of the camps, back into the high ground settlements, once they start to rebuild, they're going to be looking for furniture, you know? I figure it's like a harvest in a way. Once this stuff dries out, it doesn't smell so bad. Sanded, new coat of furnish, like new again. Get lemons, make lemonade.
One of the challenges, of course, showing it in cinemas is cinemas don't quite know what to do with a film that is different every time they play it. But the advantage is you can every night people can go out to see the film, and yet all of you and your friends will have seen different films because you'll have seen the same film but a different version of it. So you have to kind of work out in retrospect what you actually saw or didn't see, because it will always be different.
And you saw that the structure was a bit different than in Three Rails Live. In this case, the images and the text are yoked together, but I think there is an important poetic reason for using the combinatory structure, and that's, as I said, there's about 100 different of these death stories. And we're trying to have a kind of a panoramic approach to what happens in these sorts of events. So the fact that you can watch the film over and over again, and each time you're hearing about the passing of different people, is, I think, part of the point that we're trying to emphasize, is that there's a singularity to these things.
That piece is designed with more narrative flow than Three Rails, in that there's actually beginnings, middles, and endings, but they're all always changing. And I always thought of that as being like the metaphor of the waves that we're talking about. With each tide, there's another, in a sense, another array of stories to be told and deaths that happen, or potential. And in each refresh, you've got another kind of fresh set, but also a fresh sense of possibility. These characters live with hope in facing these situations, which is, I think, a very important part of talking about catastrophes or risks and dangers, is to have built in the sense of a positive sense of how one does go on despite these conditions. And I think a lot of the characters reflect that.
A little bit.
Yeah. I think we can open up to questions, maybe.
Thank you. I do have some questions. While I was listening to you at the beginning, especially, it reminded me of where I think, if I remember that piece in the correct order, she recorded different like oceans or rivers from the United States, and so every time the reader was able to play a previous text written by Stephanie Strickland, some poems, depending on the rhythms of all those different liquid spaces. And at the beginning, because of the movie you showed, it was like liquid. I immediately saw the difference between those, that piece from Stephanie, where the text was like read in different ways depending on the pace the water took at every time, and also the way the reader was choosing, the kind of water you were choosing as a reader. But here, when I was watching the whole thing, and now especially that you are showing us this narrative structure, I do want to know how every time that you say that this combinatory, and then that at some times I imagine that you want to give like this idea of different point of views because of those different narrative voices, but then the algorithm that you program changes the image with the text, so that every time would be like a new film, like you were saying now, Scott. And how does it feel as being a director, not to have or not being able to like direct?
Well, let me address it, because that's really interesting. In Three Rails, the images and the text is totally separate. And in Toxicity, each segment is it is connected. The image is connected to the text, but the segments keep changing. So it's a slightly different structure. And in a certain case, Three Rails, where everything is connected, it's very exciting as a filmmaker, because you always see your pictures differently when different text comes in. And because they're all on a theme, it in a way makes the images very new to you again. It's quite exciting as a film structure, because in fact the film that can go with one set of text does go in a very different way with another. And as we tend to play back in a way the stories of our lives in one sense and see the photos of our lives in another, and they can overlap, it gives the possibility of that excitement of how you discover something in your pictures that you didn't know was there, and where in a way pictures often trap us within memories, and how to mixing the text actually breaks that memory structure. We couldn't do that in Toxicity as practically, because we needed to bind it was quite complex amount of text, and we needed to bind some of the images more concretely to certain snippets of text. So those would bind more tightly. Because narratively it needed a bit more cohesion to keep the motifs linked through.
Yeah, and I'd say that it's really interesting to think about, and we have a long sort of laundry list of other ways that we could use the combinatory structure. One interesting thing about Three Rails Live was initially we'd talked about things being tagged thematically to the images more tightly. But then as we developed it and we tested it out, we found that it was much more interesting in a kind of poetic sense if the connection between the images and the text was more arbitrary, because it does kind of function in a way like the way that our memories do. And when you're, because they're from the same set of themes, you're going to be seeing an image which might arbitrarily end up making sense, like the train one did, or that will remind you of something that you saw 3 cycles ago. And it's also really fascinating to think about closure, both sort of narrative closure, but the way that we as readers, as viewers, as interactors form narrative closure. And then the other thing that I'd say that's interesting for me about this type of work is, in a way, it's very close to hypertext, right? Where we have these nodes of stories, and we have different paths that we navigate through them. The difference here is that rather than someone clicking on links, the system is forming these paths for us. And to me, that's, as an author, one of the things I noticed when I was writing hypertext was people would just sort of pile through these links and often not stop to read the whole node. So in a way, even though we're giving more to the system, we have more authorial control than we did with interactive hypertext.
Yeah, at the same time, it reflects a kind of psychological rebellion, which I like, because while you try and create some order about stories, and language tries to impose a structure of grammar, an expectation of conclusion. In fact, all of this stuff keeps going and changing underneath that, the way that dreams don't stop even as you try and rationally explain your life, and keeps messing up everything. So there's a wonderful sense of, I think, the potential of this kind of system to continually remind you of the chaotic rebellion that takes place inside the psychology of everyone, inside the brain, and however much you try and trap it by a surface order, this other thing keeps bubbling and churning and throwing out other stuff and destroying the order and saying, but there's this story too, and there's that story too, and then this maybe doesn't go quite the way you thought next to this man's story sounds different when it's next to this girl's story, and it continually undermines your the other aspect of one's mind that wants to create order and structure and meaning and believe that there's truth in it. So that's a real struggle.
I guess the other thing I'd say that's sort of creatively freeing about this, especially in terms of making films and the way that films are typically made, where you sort of work towards this final cut, and then it becomes very difficult to change things, is that working with this structure and with our creative process, it's a database, so we can, and we've done this over the course of several years with all these projects, where we show it, we test things out, we think of some new story ideas or characters that we want to emphasize or de-emphasize, and we can change both the pool of content that we're working with, and we can test out different models of the narrative structure and adjust them algorithmically over time. So the same project can actually generate, we can end up with many different narrative structures. It's really
yeah,
fun
we've done
way to
that for
work.
galleries that have a panoramic setup. This was filmed originally with 3 cameras spread like this in a panoramic form, so we could go in a wall or circular format. It can be put in a cinema format. We did 30-minute lengths, we did hour-and-a-half lengths, all sorts of different
And we
variations.
did this sort of character, actually this one's not the character
Right.
emphasis, it's a different.
That's right. We did another version that was driven by one character at a time. And we keep added images from odd places where we would meet and collaborate and get it one little image. It might just be an inside joke for us, but we might throw in a bit of Bergen into Pennsylvania or a little bit of Scotland. I think there's a bit of Scotland
Or our
here.
children.
Or children come in at some point. Yeah, odd things that are just snuck in here and there that are easy to add as the story goes on. We can take another question, maybe. Yes, please.
Actually, this is really great. I'm a technologist, and I like the way this approach to combinatorial kind of almost feels like how children tell a story, right?
Mm.
The perception of things can be very different to ours. I wonder whether you're ever considering this for other purposes.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done in terms of literary forms that use combinatory structures, and there's certainly, variability is core to many, for instance, games are increasingly using narrative generation. So when you're playing a game, you'll see that the experience of the world is different every time, and that's exactly this type of structure in the background. So I think that sort of algorithmic and combinatory structures are becoming a big part of digital storytelling in a broad sense.
Yeah.
Anyone else, or should we call it a night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.